Hi, welcome to this video on interfaces. So today we'll focus on interfaces. So initially I will give a brief explanation on interfaces, and then we'll go through some notes and see some examples of how interfaces work. So basically, what are interfaces? When you're looking at interfaces, firstly we need to know that we have got our classes, right? And our classes contain basically, the definitions of our objects. And then when we have interfaces, so we can say classes have the definition of objects. And then interfaces, basically, they define what a class should have at any time. So basically an interface is defining the exact things that a class should have. So it's not defining everything, but it's saying a class should have one or two things, and those things are what we call interfaces. So usually these are methods, okay? So interfaces, they define the methods that a class should have. So these are the minimum methods. It's not all the methods. So these are the minimum or compulsory methods that a class should have, okay? So a class can have 10 methods, but out of those 10 methods, there are probably 1 or 2 or 3 methods that are compulsory, and they've been defined in an interface. So let's just look at an example of what an interface would be like. So an interface, also the structure of an interface. So an interface only only shows the declaration or contains the declaration of methods only. Okay, an interface contains the declaration of methods only. So an interface, for example, would say it would just say it has got a method called drive, right? So it will just define drive in that method, and then you also declare another one, whether it's park, whether it's accelerate. So this is all it will just show. It's not going to define the construct of the method, what is in the method, how the method works. No, it's just going to declare the method like this. And then when you're now using the interface in a class, you could have a class called, let's just call it vehicle. So in your vehicle class, you could say class vehicle implements our interface. Maybe we can call it okay, so before we do this, let's just show an example of an interface. So an interface is basically has got the same construct as a class, but it's not called a class. So you may declare it as, maybe you can say public interface movements, right? So movements is our interface, and then within that interface now, that's where we'll declare our various methods. To say, for example, we don't put the access modifier because it's implicitly public, so we can say drive, park, accelerate. So what this basically means is that whenever we use this interface with a class, that class should definitely have these 3 methods. It can have as many methods it wants, but these 3 should definitely be present. If they're not present, then that class will not work properly. So when you're now creating our class that uses this implement, now this interface, we can say class vehicle, maybe our class called vehicle, and then we say implements our interface called movements. Okay, so what this now means is, as we create our class, somewhere in this class we should definitely have the methods. We should declare or create the methods drive. So here we have a method drive. Now within this class, now that's where we would then create or define the various functionalities of the drive class. Then we have park, where we also define what the park method does, and then we also have accelerate. And then we'll also define what accelerate does. So within the interface, all we do is just declare the methods and say these methods should exist within a class that uses this interface. And then using the implement keyword, like for example in Java, you're then saying this class vehicle uses the movements interface. And since we are using the movement interface, it means the class vehicle should have these three methods on top of everything else that it has. So it has got drive, park, and accelerate. And within this class now, that's where we actually define what the drive function does, the park function does, and what the accelerate function does. We can also declare public variables or constant variables within this class vehicle. So we could also have maybe some public variable, maybe to say public wheels, or public fuel. Well, like I said, they're implicitly public. So you could declare your variables like this to say this could be int, this could be string. So what this also means is that since we have declared these variables in an interface, that means the class vehicle should somewhere in its construct use these two. It should somewhere in its construct use these two variables. They should definitely exist, and they usually are constants. So it could be a constant int, maybe is equal to 4 wheels, right? And constant string is equal to petrol. So somewhere it's supposed to use these methods and these variables in its class. So basically that's the simple definition of how an interface works. It just defines the variables and the methods that a class is definitely supposed to have, and then when you call that interface using the implements keyword on a class, that class should define those methods and show how they're implemented, as well as the various variables. So here you could actually use those variables that we created. So now let's look at some notes and see how we can define or build on this topic further. So basically an interface is a group of related methods with empty bodies and might also contain constant definitions. So as I was saying, they are related methods. That means they move together. They have to always be there. So in this interface, these are the related methods. They're always there together. So where one exists, the other should exist. They always move in that bench. And they contain empty bodies. So as you can see, there is nothing defined in these interfaces. In these methods, they contain empty bodies as long as they're in the interface definition. And they might also contain constant definitions like the variables that we have. So always remember, when you're defining our interface, it just has the names of the classes, of the methods, just defining the methods, and they have no bodies. So an interface forms a contract between the class and the outside world. So what is this contract that the interface forms with the class? The contract that the interface forms with the class is that the class is going to use every method and constant defined in the interface. That's the contract that exists between the class and the interface. So the contract would be the class is going to use all the methods and constants defined in the interface. That's the contract. So as I said before, everything that's in the interface should definitely appear somewhere within our class. So an interface can extend any number of interfaces. So you could also have an interface extending more interfaces and the like. So a class realizes the method of an interface. So a class then implements the method of which is contained in that interface. So if we look at this diagram here, we have got an interface called payable. And this interface now is used by a class called invoice and a class called employee. But you'll find that there's also a class called salaried employee, which is inheriting from the class employee. So basically, the class salaried employee is also implementing the interface payable since it's inheriting the employee class which is using the interface payable. So the payable interface contains a method which is called getPaymentAmount, which is then implemented by the invoice and employee classes. So in this interface, we've got a method called getPaymentAmount, so which means then that the invoice and employee class should definitely implement the method getPaymentAmount. So let's look at an example of that. So this is our interface. So we are using Java. So we could say public interface payable. So we are declaring the interface. So this is how you declare it in Java. And then, as I said, you just give the data type as well as the return type as well as the method. Okay. So this method is getPaymentAmount, and it's supposed to be implemented by any class that implements this interface. So an interface can contain constant declarations in addition to method declarations, and all constants are implicitly public, static, and final. So this is how you declare an interface. Now let's look at how you use the interface. So we've got a class called invoice. Based on this, we've got this class called invoice, and here we are actually implementing the invoice class. So we have declared the invoice class, and now using the implements keyword, we then use the payable interface. So this statement alone shows you that you need to implement the getPaymentAmount method, which is defined by the what? By the interface payable. So that means somewhere within this class, we are supposed to have the getPaymentAmount class defined. So here we've got the usual stuff. We've declared our variables. We have our constructor, which is setting some values. And then we've got other methods that are within the class. But what we really want is, we are not worried about all these methods that are within the class. We are worried to see that have we implemented the getPaymentAmount method that is defined in the interface. And yes, we have. So here is the getPaymentAmount, which so we are declaring the getPaymentAmount to fulfill the contract with interface payable. So remember the contract that we're speaking of, to say the class is going to use all the methods and constants defined in the interface. And in our interface, we have defined the getPaymentAmount. So this class is supposed to define and use the getPaymentAmount method. So here it is, and it has been well implemented. So here we've seen its expansion. We now see the code inside, but when it's declared within the interface does not show the body of the method. That's very important to remember. So just remember the contract that exists between the interface and the class is that whenever a class implements an interface, it should use all the methods and constants within that interface. So when we are also creating a class, right, a class can implement as many interfaces as it needs. So here we can just say, we can use a comma to separate the various interfaces that we want to use. So for example, in this instance, we say public, a certain class may be called salaried employee. So in public class salaried employee, it extends a certain class, which is the superclass, which we could call the employee class, and then which implements one first interface, second interface, third interface. You can implement as many interfaces as you want, just separating them with a comma. So you're not limited to which interfaces you implement, but the moment that you implement an interface, you're supposed to adhere to that contract that exists between an interface and a class. So let's look at another example. So public abstract class employee implements payable. So clearly, like we said before, we now know that we need to what? We need to use the getPaymentAmount method defined in the interface payable. And then we see here that we are not using, is not implemented here because the class must be declared abstract to avoid a compilation error. Okay? The class must be declared abstract to avoid a compilation error, because we are using an abstract class to be able to, we are using an abstract class, and therefore it will not be able to implement this thing. So basically that's how an interface works. And for more information on how interfaces work, you can look at the various notes that we are going to be using, and you can also ask me any questions at any time, and we'll help each other understand interfaces. But basically that's how interfaces work in object-oriented programming. So thank you for listening.